Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday I did the first part of What is Believing, and we began with where talk about Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, a video by Paul Maxwell, and I'm going to continue it today. And we began with this, well, it's pretty well known answer by Jordan Peterson about why doesn't he say yes or no with respect to believing in God. And on one level, as a number of people pointed out in the comment section, which I've pointed out in previous videos, at an epistemological level, when Peterson says, I act as if, that what we do is a better indicator of this thing that we believe than what comes out of our mouth. That is true at an epistemological level. On the other hand, there's this other aspect of humanity where the words that we use are important. And of course, Peterson would back this up. Peterson is famous for talking about how he chooses his words very carefully to speak the truth, or at least don't lie, so on and so forth. So words are important, and we're wrestling with this word belief, which is in fact the subtitle of Peterson's most important book, Maps of Meaning, the architecture of belief. And so what is believing? What does that really entail, and how do we go about this? So we began with this very famous interview that Jordan Peterson did on PBS with Margaret Hoover on Firing Line. And then I went through the first half of Paul Maxwell's really wonderful little summary of all of philosophy in 27 and a half minutes. And it's a fun video, and I really congratulate Paul for pulling that video off. Now, of course, in 27 minutes, you're not going to say everything that can be said about philosophy, but he gives a nice little structure whereby you can, with 6 words, you can sort of get a sense of what philosophy is. And his 6 words are metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, the pre-modern philosophers, the modern philosophers, and the postmodern philosophers. And actually, in this video, I'm going to play the second half of Paul's video. And I also contrasted David Nasser, who is a Christian, and I made the point that Christians usually act in a very pre-modern way when they talk about what they believe, because they begin with metaphysics. I believe in God. In fact, I'm looking forward to Jordan Peterson getting into Exodus to hear how he wants to treat the burning bush episode when God says, I am, I will be what I will be, I am what I am. And so is this understood epistemologically? I will be what I will be. Is this understood ontologically, metaphysically? It's, that is a huge passage in Christianity and Judaism, and I'm really looking forward to see how Jordan treats it. But Jordan acts as a modern in that he begins with epistemology, and that's what Paul Maxwell noted. He begins with epistemology because modernity is uncertain about metaphysics. And we're uncertain about metaphysics because of the whole stream of philosophy, how that's all rolled out. Christians don't tend to be that concerned with it. They usually begin with metaphysics, and then epistemology, and then axiology, as Paul said. And David Nasser asked Jordan Peterson, "Are we just preaching to ourselves?" And really, the operative word there is just, because actually preaching to ourselves, especially when you get into the context of a church, is a very powerful thing. And this gets into Jonathan Haidt's observation of riders on elephants. We are very communal creatures. We are shaped by the people around us. We are keyed into, and Peterson makes this point often, we are keyed into status differentials and hierarchies. And if believing something if saying we believe something will push us up on the hierarchy, we'll do it. If identifying as a certain thing pushes us up on the hierarchy, we'll do it. We're really tuned into this kind of thing, and we are biologically tuned for this kind of thing, which means that in terms of the big 5 personalities, being disagreeable is our local Jordan Peterson meetup at Living Stones is full of disagreeable people, and we have a great amount of fun together. And it's mostly men who have learned how to actually get along with one another while being disagreeable. That's probably the dominant trait of our local meetup. And then we got into John Vervaeke's Meaning Crisis, episode number 13, where he's dealing with Stephen Batchelor's After Buddhism and a bunch of those books. I'd never heard of him. I'd never read those books. Actually, I saw in the comment section Job, who's my friend from the Netherlands, I've done a bunch of videos with, really recommended some of Batchelor's books, so I'll probably take a look at them. And I know some of you will be, why should a Christian minister look at Buddhist books? Well, because I live in Northern California, and I've got good friends who they're predominantly secular people, but they use Buddhism as a way to get some things out of life that they want to get out of life. And you say, well, you're a pastor, shouldn't you convert them? Well, I'm a Calvinist pastor. I can't convert anybody. It's the job of the Holy Spirit to convert people. I'll do my best to bear witness to them. And would I like for them to join the Christian faith? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to read books on Buddhism and such. I frankly think as a pastor who is also a missionary and an evangelist, I think that's very much part of my job to learn about other people and their beliefs and their belief systems. But what we're exploring here is not simply different religions. And again, this is why I really appreciate John Vervaeke's videos. We're trying to figure out what we mean when we say, I believe in something. And again, all the way back to Peterson's interview, and he said this many times in different places, we're not quite sure what we mean when we say we believe something. And so you've got the question of what do we mean by I believe, and what do we mean by God? And if you've been following my videos for long enough, you know we've talked a lot about that. And again, if you're a Christian and you say, well, I'm very settled on what I believe by God, well, great. I frankly am too at the age of 55. But it's also a part of Christian doctrine that God is always beyond our comprehension. And so to the degree that I can learn more about God and love God with my mind, that's also part of my Christian calling and duty. So I am going to continue to explore this. So that's a little background into this. So I want to jump back into John Vervaeke's video. He had just, well, maybe I'll go back a little bit and play some of it. Hang on, I got to set this up.
So he proposes instead what we need to do is...
Okay, so right there you can see he's got Buddhism within a tradition, outside of the tradition. And I talked in the last video about this language of belief and how actually within traditions, and I'd say within competing traditions and even within warring traditions, the wars are fought over words and beliefs. The great schism between the Latin church and the Greek church that happened that split the Orthodox Church from the Roman Catholic Church. One church historian said they had a tizzy over a diphthong. You know, it was over a word in terms of how to understand this word. And theologians, the great wars over the confessional wars in the Protestant period are fought over words. You've got the 5 points of Calvinism, and you've got Arminian positions, and you've got all these theological battles are fought with words. And that's important. I mean, these words are important. And then the question is, what are these words, and how do we use these words, and why do we use these words to track things that, well, the only way we can hope to represent them often is with, well, I wouldn't say the only way. Ideally we represent them with our actions, and that gets again into Jordan Peterson's observation. But one of the most convenient ways that we can actually productively work together on conflicts, theological conflicts, religious disagreements, is with words. But the words fall short, and that's part of the point that John Vervaeke and Stephen Batchelor are making as they're looking at, well, you've got the perspective within the tradition, which is subjective. You've got the perspective outside the tradition, and both of these get caught on these beliefs. And when we say beliefs here, we're meaning that they're attached to words. These are ideas that we have. And even again, I should have looked him up because I couldn't think of his name yesterday. Of course I did on medieval, on Reformation, on the period of the Reformation. Christian theology has always understood that on one hand, the faith is these set of doctrines, the creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, in my denominational context, the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Canons of Dort. Sometimes we call that the faith. It's not often called that in the New Testament, actually, but that's a legitimate way of describing the faith. It's a way of representing the faith. But Christians have always known that, you get this all the way in the book of James, faith is in action. And the book of James says, okay, show me your faith by your words. I'll show you my faith by my action. So you've got these two realms. And so in a sense, you've got nouns and verbs that you're dealing with. But even the connection between the nouns and the faith is dicey. And Vervaeke has just gone through that. You can watch, I'll put the link to his whole video in here, and I treated the part of the video that I'm not showing here in the first part of this, but now he's going to deal with Buddhism, and I think it's kind of handy for Christians to actually watch someone else deal with another faith that way, because by virtue of the fact that we're deeply committed and invested in our faith, there's all kinds of things we're going to get triggered by and hung up on as someone talks about it. So having him talk about something else is actually pretty handy. So let's have him continue here.
We need to look at Buddhism ultimately existentially. Now you remember, existentially has to do with these modes. He also invokes along with others, the distinction between the being mode and the having mode, and he proposes that Buddhism is remembering the being mode, and I've already talked about that in a previous video. And so he says, look, traditionally what the Buddha said, and now we're returning to what the Buddha said is in order to try and get more of what his enlightenment was about. Traditionally what the Buddha said is presented as the Four Noble Truths. And these are four statements or propositions that are usually presented to our ears as claims to be believed.
And then this again would be something analogous to our creeds.
What makes you a Buddhist is if you believe them. The problem,
if you, and I put in a different word here, if you subscribe to them. In the Christian Reformed Church for years, we had a thing called the form of subscription. And so here you had your doctrines, and you'd sign your name when you would start your term as an office bearer in a local church. If you would go to a classis meeting, if you would go to synod, you would show your commitment to the community by subscribing to these documents. Now, the form of subscription had a number of clauses in it which were left a little bit of wiggle room or fudge area, things such as we subscribe to the doctrines themselves, not necessarily that these doctrines are best articulated by these particular documents. And right there you have a very interesting, you set up with that language a very interesting relationship between that's saying that there's actually a doctrine out there, and sort of like a math. There's a doctrine out there that is represented by this document, but even the document that establishes the doctrine can't quite represent it the best. So you might have in your mind some other words that express the doctrine better than the document, even if historically the church that subscribed to the doctrine came out of that document. Now, this is a very interesting dynamic, but it's right there in the mechanism of the Christian Reformed Church. You will find it in other denominations. It's the idea that we subscribe to a doctrine that, well, these are maybe the best words that we had. For example, there are lines in the Belgian Confession about detestable Anabaptists. Now, Julian, who many of you know from a couple of my interviews, and he's in the comment section usually, Julian is a Hutterite. A Hutterite is an Anabaptist, and I do not think that Julian is detestable. And this is one of the particular things that in our denomination's history we got clear, that although the Belgian Confession calls the Anabaptists detestable, that was out of a certain perspective in the Low Countries at a certain point in history, and there's a lot of history behind the relationships between the Roman Catholics and the Reformed and the Lutherans and the Anabaptists, and that led Guido de Bray to call them detestable. But when I signed the form of subscription, now renamed in the Christian Reformed Church, the Covenant for Office Bearers, I am not subscribing to the idea that Anabaptists are detestable. We say that this the line about detestable Anabaptist is in fact a sort of a historical accident, and it's separate from the doctrine that I'm subscribing to by putting my name behind that document. Now, some of you will say, that's why I belong to a church that doesn't have doctrines. And I would say, you belong to a church that has implicit doctrines that you don't even have words for. But the difficulty is, how do you actually work on your beliefs without both this question of having words out there in a document that say it, and also having identity that is established by signing on to a document that says, I believe this. And so that's the game that we have been playing. But what John Vervaeke is doing is saying, okay, well, in the context of Buddhism, let's look up the Four Noble Truths. And if Wikipedia will show you the Four Noble Truths. I mean, this is the objective academic study of religion. They will talk about the Four Noble Truths. And I think I've got some books down here. Do I have Houston Smith's World Religions book? Well, I don't know if she has it in here, but you can find this. And so, all life is suffering. Well, let's talk about that.
The problem with this, of course, is that it is taking place at this very level that Batchelor argues we need to get beyond. It's not, of course, that people don't believe things within Buddhism. It's that what we've been talking about here, these processes of transformation, are taking place at the level of perspectival knowing, at the level of transforming of states of consciousness, and at the participatory level, transforming the fundamental machinery of the self, of the agent-arena relationship, and the modes of existence. So we need to understand these Four Noble Truths as things that could help afford the kind of transformations we've been talking about.
Now, right there, I'm going to play that again because it's a really important sentence.
The point is that, so we need to understand these Four Noble Truths as things that could help afford the kind of transformations we've been talking about.
This is in many ways the job of preachers. That here's these truths in this book, and we want to enable this to transform the people of the congregation. That's what preaching is. And it's really hard. and many of us will complain, and in the comment section there's regular commentary on people's experience in churches, that they've gone to a church and they find the people dead. Now, they don't believe there's actually corpses in the church, but they don't find the faith living in the place. And this is something that Christians talk about all the time, is, well, the gospel seems to be alive in that place, or the gospel seems to be alive in that person, or I can see Christ through them. This is the same dynamic of taking, say, the words of the Apostles' Creed and Well, logos becoming flesh, incarnation. And you see, it's in a sense the reverse of, what the Bible is. Well, this gets into, I don't know if I have Pete Enns' book handy here. Pete Enns' first book, which I thought, which is probably my favorite of Peter Enns' books. Peter Enns is a whole nother topic of conversation for me. But the Bible is called the Word of God, and Jesus is called the Word of God. And it's really interesting to think through those relationships, because a lot of debate in Christianity about this book. What is this book? And I've made the point before that this book is kind of it has a, I get into trouble with all these words. It has kind of a shamanistic capacity. When Christians do their devotions, what's happening is that ideally what's happening is that, and I can put it into Christian terms, by the work of the Holy Spirit, reading this book changes us. Well, how does it change us? It's a psychotechnology. It forces us to look at the world through a different lens. John Calvin calls the Bible glasses that we wear to see the world differently. And that's what John Calvin said. And so part of the reason a practice of Christian devotion and discipline is we sit down and we read our Bible and we meditate on it, and we have the Bible change us, and we have the Bible change how we see the world. And you'll notice, I've got a conversation with David that I'll be posting in a few days, either late this week or early next week, where he and a number of other people have mentioned this in their practice, their Christian spiritual practice. They are copying the Bible. And you might say, well, what kind of a crazy idea is that? I've got how many dozens of Bibles in this room? Do we really need one more? But actually what he's doing when he's copying the Bible, it's a psychotechnology. It slows him down. And David will talk about how copying John 5, which is a particularly, most of you, if I say John 3, you'll recognize it. John 4, woman at the well. John 6, eat my body and blood. John 10, I am the good shepherd. John 11, Lazarus. John 13, washing the feet of his disciples. John 15, abide with me. I mean, on and on and on and on and on. John 1, the Word made flesh, Logos. All of these famous chapters of the Gospel of John. John 5, it's not mentioned, but there's some really interesting passages in there and a lot of repetition, and he's copying it all, and it's changing him as he's doing it. And again, it's this process of the Logos becomes flesh, but that's in a sense the process that has to happen when preachers preach, and when we do Bible study and we open the Bible and we read it, that the words become flesh. But these words that were written thousands of years ago in radically different languages and cultures where we are, that somehow they become flesh in the church.
The point about these is not to believe them. The point about them is to get them to help you reenact the Buddha's enlightenment.
Okay. So, translating this to Christian terms, the point of them is not to merely subscribe to them. The point of them is that the Logos becomes flesh. And this enlightenment, as he's talking about in a Buddhist context, in a Christian context, that our lives are transformed. And again, in Christian theology, we talk about this. There's missiology too. There's nothing more powerful than a transformed life, actually, evangelistically. That's how we work.
If you're not doing that, if you cannot enact enlightenment, then you are not getting the Four Noble Truths.
Now again, if you remember where I stopped with the Nasser conversation, there's this point in Christianity where Christ is the one who's saving. And Peterson, that's a place that Peterson is sort of hung up on, and rightly so. The Christian church has been hung up on this for at least 500 years. Well, and it all has everything to do with agency. When is God acting, and when am I acting? And again, I'll use this idea that I borrow from Dorothy Sayers, who C.S. Lewis got it from her. You know, when is Tolkien acting, and when is Frodo acting? Now you wouldn't say that Tolkien and Frodo are the same, because Tolkien is, distributed throughout the story. But the analogy isn't exactly perfect, because we certainly have more agency than the character of Frodo in the story. But the analogy is illuminating, because it's illuminating, and C.S. Lewis talks about this a little bit in Mere Christianity, because we don't, to figure out how God acts and how we act, well, this is in many ways the focus of the story of Joseph. And Joseph says to his brothers, who after Jacob's death are fearful that Joseph will now take revenge upon them, you meant it for evil. Well, what? Well, beating him into an inch of his, beating him to within an inch of his life, leaving him for dead, and then deciding that, murder, the only problem with murder is that there's no money in it, so they might as well sell him to their cousins into slavery in Egypt. And so if anybody had, a right to take some revenge, it was Joseph. And Joseph says to his brothers at the end of the book of Genesis, which is a very important passage that looks back through the whole story of Genesis, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. What does that mean? That God beat up Joseph, left him for dead, fooled their father with a bloody coat and with a bloody robe, and then sold their own brother into slavery? Did God do that? No. But where is God in this? And we don't know how to talk about this. And this again is one of these places that language is a tool that we use to get clear on things. And that's why Peterson is exactly right. If you really want to get clear on something, write it out or try to talk it out, which is what I'm doing here. But it's a tool, and all is very hard.
Proposes, therefore, that we should not call them the Four Noble Enlightenment, then you are not getting the Four Noble Truths. He proposes, therefore, that we should not call them the Four Noble Truths, we should call them the Four Ennobling Truths. I then proposed to him in person that we...
See, and what's interesting, and I haven't read Bachelor, so I may have this totally wrong, but for ennobling truths, notice how it's almost, in biblical studies, you have this thing called the divine passive. When something just happens, sometimes it's a biblical writer's way of saying God did it. The four ennobling truths is almost a divine passive, that, well, these truths somehow transform you. And, well, then the question is, well, where's the agent in that? And when we're talking agency, we might, since we all got into this because of some pronouns, we might say, who's the agent in that?
We shouldn't even call them truths anymore, because truth is a property of propositions. Actually, I said what you should call them is the four ennobling provocations. You're trying to provoke people into change.
And again, I mean, there's a lot of carryover in terms of preaching with something like this, because you're trying to provoke people into change. And so this sentence, this first noble truth that he's about to go into, this is supposed to provoke you. This is supposed to disturb you. This is supposed to begin a process of transformation by which at the end of it you will be a different person. Well, what do I mean by that? Now we're talking identity again, if you go back to the other video, and we're going to talk about identity a lot more later when we get into the Gospel Coalition and Tim Keller. But something about this sentence changes you. And again, getting back to David, whose video I'll post in a little while, something about copying the book of John changes him. It's provoking, and I really like that word.
So let me try and go through the four noble truths, but restating them as four enabling, that means affording self-transcendence, provocations. By doing that, I think we can get back to, if that's the right verb, what the Buddha was conveying about what's going on.
Now, getting back to is something that we're going to talk about quite a bit when we get over to Owen Barfield, because there's this funny word that we use all the time, consciousness. And I should probably do a words that fudge on that word, because do we actually know what we're talking about when we use that word? We kind of do, and it's sort of illuminating about the way we use language. So here we have this experience we call consciousness, and I have it, and I look around at other people and they seem to be having it too. And when we get into Rupert Sheldrake and some of those things and panpsychism, does this little earbud holder, does this have consciousness? Well, probably not. Rupert Sheldrake makes the point, well, the sun has, how much electricity going on, and if we say that consciousness is somehow the byproduct of electricity, well, does the sun have consciousness? Does the sun have agency then? Is it proper to use that language with it? Can we go back to, because when we're talking about the Buddha, this stuff is hard. So you're talking about a specific character in history, Siddhartha Gautama, but when you use the word Buddha, you're talking about also a class, in a sense, of characters, or a group of characters. Now, when Peterson was at Liberty University and he talked about someone having a father, and that father needs to be, you need to transcend that to be the father, kind of through a Jungian transformation. There's a move like that. And Jesus, I'll often ask my Sunday school class, we say Jesus Christ. Is Christ Jesus' last name? No, it isn't. Christ is a title. It means anointed one. You can read the Heidelberg Catechism all about it. Christ is a title. It means anointed one. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean for someone to be anointed? And then the Apostle Paul in the New Testament talks about us being in Christ. What does that mean? And very quickly, Christ takes on there's the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, and then there's Christ. And what's the relationship between those two words? What are they pointing to?
In enlightenment, what kind of transformation is being brought about by the awakening experience? And what is it alleviating? Okay, so let's go through these one by one. Okay, so I'll present the standard way of representing the truth and then the reformulation in order to deal with Batchelor's, I think, astute criticism, and in order to interconnect with all the argumentation we have been developing throughout this video series. So the first one is typically stated as all is suffering, or all of life is suffering. Now, that's, first of all, if that were the statement to be believed, it's false. Because suffering is a comparative term, and comparative terms can't be extended to everything. That would be like saying everything is tall. It doesn't make any sense. Things are only tall relative to other things being shorter.
Now, what's interesting here, and I haven't really thought this through, when you look at, say, Paul Maxwell's metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, and you listen to John Vervaeke's treatment of this First Noble Truth, you almost have the sense that pre-moderns began with metaphysics, moderns begin with epistemology, postmoderns begin with axiology. Okay, and John's observation here that the suffering is almost an axiological term.
So, first of all, it doesn't really mean all is. It's something more like all is threatened by. Well, what's the all? Does it mean everything in existence? Should we interpret it metaphysically? Well, I mentioned last time that we should be careful about giving metaphysical interpretations to what people bring out of these awakening experiences. And the Buddha himself was famously reticent to give any metaphysical interpretations to his statements. So let's try and follow that. In order to get at that, let's note what this word means. Okay?
Suffering.
Because again, we've tended to allow a word to go through a process of trivialization and reduction, and we've lost part of the meaning.
Okay, so right here, this is going to be important when we look at Barfield a little bit later. Words have souls. Words change over time in their context, and we know this. And we know this pretty definitely. That's not really a question. And so when we talk about suffering, and someone 1,000 years ago talked about suffering, what are these words actually connecting to if we use kind of a correspondence idea of language, which words really aren't the best connectors, but because they work within an economy of meaning that connects them with things. But that's where we're getting at.
Let me give you, first of all, an analogy. Okay, so the original meaning of this word is insane.
Mad. He writes the word mad on the board for those of you just listening.
It has come to be synonymous with angry. I'm mad at Agnes. Doesn't mean I'm insane, right? It means that I'm angry at Agnes. How did that happen? Well, one of the ideas is anger is a state that can render you, if it becomes extreme anger can render you temporarily insane, and therefore temporarily mad. Anger is a cause, a pertinent cause of madness. Okay, so suffering, people usually hear pain, distress when they hear the word suffering. That person is suffering. But that's not actually what the word means. To suffer means to undergo. It means to lose agency. So you can actually suffer joy.
Now, this I found terribly fascinating. I'm not quite. I'm going to have to think about this quite a bit more. But you'll see where it goes for me in a little bit.
You can have so much joy that you sort of have lost control of yourself. You can have so much pleasure. It is not oxymoronic to say, I'm suffering pleasure. It means I'm having so much pleasure that I've sort of lost control of the situation, right? Now, pain is a very powerful way of losing agency.
Now, to a degree, what we're doing here is we're really elevating agency up a value hierarchy, and that's very contemporary for us. It's very modern for us. That is, in fact, in a sense, what I do whenever I say, if you have an impersonal realm, the agent becomes king, because the agent colonizes. And so suffering is loss of agency. I find this a tremendously interesting and I think potentially fruitful association.
Why? First of all, it's highly disruptive. And secondly, pain is associated usually with damage, and damage is a state in which we're often losing agency. So, right? Don't hear just pain. The Buddha is not saying everything's painful. That's ridiculous, because if everything was painful, nothing would be painful. Even all of your experiences can be painful. Doesn't mean anything particular. because many of your experiences can't be painful in and of themselves, right? Because, again, this isn't an absolute kind of claim. Instead, pay attention to this connection rather than this one.
He circled suffering and loss of agency instead of pain.
Last video gave a parable of this suffering. It's the monkey that grabs the pitch and then tries to free itself, and then the other hand gets stuck in both paws and head, and then it gets killed. There's nothing in there of pain. Most of the Buddha's metaphors are not pain metaphors, they're entrapment metaphors. Being fettered, losing your freedom, losing your agency.
Now this too, in terms of freedom, is really important, and Christians have been talking about this quite a bit, because there's the two sides of freedom. There's positive and negative. One is freedom from, and the other is freedom to. Freedom from restraint, constraint, freedom from imprisonment, freedom from regulation, freedom from prohibition. That's freedom from. Freedom to play a great piece on the piano. Freedom to run a marathon in a certain amount of time, to run a mile in a certain amount of time. Freedom to speak eloquently. And what we notice, that freedom to requires an investment in agency, whereas freedom from usually demands less agency on the part of others pointing my way. Okay?
That's why the Buddha doesn't describe enlightenment in terms of relief, but he would famously say, just like wherever you dip into the ocean, it has one taste, the taste of salt. No matter where you dip into my teaching, it has one taste, the taste of freedom. Okay? So what he seems to be saying is that all of your life is threatened with the possibility of losing your freedom. So let's go from
losing your agency
is suffering to a provocation. Realize that all of your life is threatened with a loss of freedom, a loss of agency. And there's a word for this kind of loss that's often translated as suffering, which is dukkha. Dukkha, again, does not mean pain. What does dukkha mean? Well, the etymology is, imagine you have a wheel, and it's off-center on its axis. So the axle is not properly going through the center of the wheel, and as the wheel is turning, it's destroying itself. So there's a self-destructiveness. Or you have, your arm is out of joint, it's disjointed, like when Shakespeare has, Hamlet says, the time is out of joint, right? It's out of joint, and as you're moving your arm, it's destroying itself.
See, I wonder, listening to him, the degree to which this can be associated with decay, which those of you who, this is long before I got into Jordan Peterson, one of the things that I talked about is the Bible tells time in two different ages. There's the present evil age. I call it the age of decay. Now, what happens in the resurrection, we're getting on to Easter, is that Jesus is raised with a body without decay. And you can read that in 1 Corinthians 15. You can read about that in Romans 8. The world is subject to decay. This very much gets into Greek thought. That here in this world, everything is subject to decay. Everything breaks down. Institutions break down. Our bodies break down. Things break down. This is similar in some ways to entropy, is that everything decays. And Jesus is raised with a body that is not subject to decay. And that's crucial for understanding what Paul has to say about the resurrected Christ, and what Paul has to say about our resurrection, that we will be raised to have bodies, spiritual bodies. And what he means by that is not immaterial bodies, but rather, this gets into matter, form, all of this stuff that we've been talking about with Vervaeke stuff too, and Aristotle and philosophy, but we're raised no longer subject to decay. That means that our loves, all, as C.S. Lewis says, all love is destroyed by death or betrayal. Well, in the age to come, love is eternal. You can hear that in terms of, you find an association with Platonic forms in there, because for Plato, the form is without decay. So every love in this world, you can see this a little bit in the Lord of the Rings with Aragorn and the elf, his elf wife. Elves don't decay like humans. Humans decay. Elves don't. Elves go off into this other land, where the undying land, and there's this interaction between those two ideas in subplot in the Lord of the Rings. And so we're raised, all love decays except the idea of love does not decay. It's kind of a Platonic form idea. So this idea of suffering, if it's understood the way John is understanding, I hear it very much in terms of, all life decays. And this is obviously an observation and a realization that can come through observation, which is very old and very persistent. And I think actually a lot of the Christian story is understood as, up in heaven things don't decay, down on earth things decay, and the Bible is the story as an axial age, the story of the reconciliation of heaven and earth. And whereas in fact heaven conquers earth in the book of Revelation, and everything is thrown to the sea of fire and is destroyed in that way. So
it means like an empty gap that's sort of dirty, so that as things are moving within it, they're destroying themselves. So the idea of something that's engaged in a process of self-destruction, which of course is one of the powerful ways you can lose your agency, is through self-destructive processes, is what's going on here. So realize that all of your life is threatened, very really threatened, existentially threatened, by a capacity for self-destructive behavior. Self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. So now you see what he's doing is so situated very firmly within the axial tradition. So what does he mean here? How can we try and understand this a little bit better? So this is work based on some stuff I've published with Leo Ferraro, and then I'll talk about some additional and important new work by Mark Lewis. I want to try and trace a kind of pattern in your cognitive processing that can vary.
Watch the rest of the video. It's all quite cool. And he gets into addiction, which is interesting because, if you watch the previous video, Peterson and Nass are getting into this question of addiction. And so it's very interesting for us to wrestle with this idea of what is addiction. And because obviously, as human beings, let's talk broads. When we talk with Peterson, Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, we celebrate the accomplishments of the Enlightenment. And one of the things that the Enlightenment did was give us human beings tremendous power over nature, to the degree that we are no longer as subject to the ravages of disease, famine, maybe war. Because war is our agency is all over war in the way that it isn't quite all over disease and famine. And we can argue about that. But since the Enlightenment, since really the last 100 years, tremendous advances against disease and famine. Addiction, however, like war, is us. This is something, and with the increase of our power, we discover that a lot of the power we have more difficulty coming to terms with is our own power. And addiction is self-destruction becoming powerless by our own power. Okay, so if we have the power to create really engaging computer games and simulations, do we have the power to not resist them? And why is it that the person, let's say, who's playing computer games all the time feels like they are maximizing their agency, they are living in a flow state, but the other people watching them look at that as a negative addiction, that they are in fact losing their life by sitting motionless with their eyes to a screen and their hands on some controller? That's a very interesting question. So, but let's move on. Let's move on from John's video, and again, his video is out there and you can watch the whole thing. And I want to turn to someone that you probably wouldn't expect me to turn, which is the Gospel Coalition. The Gospel Coalition was a group of, it was formed by a group of friends who were also Reformed pastors and theologians. Really, the three cornerstones of this movement are Tim Keller, John Piper, and Don Carson. Now, Carson is a New Testament scholar. Tim Keller and John Piper are both pastors, okay? So they're not predominantly scholars, but they got together and formed this thing called the Gospel Coalition, which has really ridden the wave of what was called the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement in evangelicalism. And the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement over the last 15, 20 years, I think part of it is in response to the Seeker movement, and that's a lot of church inside talk. Seeker movement typified by Willow Creek, Bill Hybels, Saddleback, Rick Warren, this whole wave of churches that had big sound, theatrical lighting, movie theater or auditorium architecture, and the emphasis was on the sermon, and the sermon, again, being a central transformational piece, but the rest of the liturgy, and you might say, well, is that liturgy? Yeah, it's liturgy. The rest of the liturgy with the in Willow Creek's with the jazz music, or maybe Hillsong, the power to, in a sense, what happened really in that mode of evangelicalism, in the seeker mode, was that contemporary music and theatrics and homiletics, really combined with classic Christian homiletics, to produce a transformational experience whereby people would be changed in the chairs. And we could understand this in a sense, because when you walked into, Notre Dame just burned, but before it burned, if you walked into Notre Dame, you would say, the architecture and all that was put into Notre Dame and any cathedral was a way of transforming us, and you would feel its power. Now, in the seeker movement, you had liturgy, you had contemporary music, so you lessened the learning curve. You basically appropriated all of the learning that people were doing listening to pop radio or jazz music, so you appropriated those learning curves, and you took Christian words and you implanted them in some of this other musical genre. And you then took the very powerful psychotechnologies that rock concerts have employed. So there's communal technologies going on there, and you employed all of that to bring people to make a profession of belief, and to articulate that profession of belief in words, and to come to what was actually predates the seeker movement, things like the sinner's prayer, or the Roman road, or the four spiritual laws. And those of you who are familiar with evangelical Christianity know what I'm talking about. Those of you who are less familiar with evangelical Christianity, don't worry about it. But these are all ways to get people to change their identity. Now, when you've got a big movement like that, you've got a certain amount of disagreeable people in the population that are going to walk into a place like that, and they're going to see the always beautiful people on stage, just like on the evening TV news, beautiful singers, talented musicians, theater lighting, good coffee and I have a whole A wall of tapes from Bill Hybels that'll tell you how to do this. Make sure the bathrooms are clean. Make sure the coffee is good. Make sure the parking is available. You employ all of these things that business and marketing have used in the commercial space, and you bring it all into the church, and you bring them into an experience, and you bring this all, and you bring them to a place where they will make a profession of belief with their lips. I believe in Jesus. I believe that Jesus died to save me from my sins. I am a new creation. And this gets into David Nasser's, butting into AA doctrine, which said, I am an alcoholic even if I haven't had a drop to drink in 30 years. I am still an alcoholic. That's part of me, my identity. So Christians, all of this employed to bring you to a point. Now, a certain number of Christians went into this and said, I think I'm being manipulated. Well, when you go into a mall, see my video a few times before about James K.A. Smith. When you go into a mall, yeah, you're being manipulated. In fact, when you're going to Notre Dame, you're being manipulated. People, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether implicitly or explicitly, when you design a building, you are shaping an experience of intended viewers. We do this all the time. When you landscape, you do it. When you put up a sign that has letters on, you do it. When you create a logo for a corporate brand or a color, where you have an apple with a little bite out of it. Oh my, what does that mean? What story is he telling in that apple with a little bite out of it? The cult of Mac. All of this stuff is liturgy and communicating, and all of this is going on. Now the Gospel Coalition, in many ways, appropriated a lot of stuff from a very powerful Christian movement called Puritanism, and many of you have heard about it. Weren't those the people that, the Pilgrims, they were kind of extreme Puritans, and they went to America to found their city on a hill. Yeah, city on a hill. It's a phrase with a very long story behind it. So they went to America to found their city on the hill, and as things heated up in Europe, the more Puritans came over and began to dominate the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and were incredibly formative in the creation of American culture. Now what happened as a response to the seeker movement, you have the young, restless, and reformed movement in Christianity that actually began to gobble up. Tim Keller is a Presbyterian Church in America pastor. That's more classical Presbyterian, conservative Presbyterian, Reformed. They baptize babies. John Piper is one of these Reformed Baptist groups. They don't baptize babies. They practice believer baptism, but they have similar doctrinal statements that come out of Calvinism. Now, I put Mark Driscoll on there because Mark Driscoll, John Piper, before Mark Driscoll's fall, John Piper was never quite at ease with Mark Driscoll, and I think John Piper wouldn't have put the words on it, but John Piper would say, Mark Driscoll doesn't look as stable as Tim Keller, let's say. And I don't mean that psychologically or emotionally. I mean that in terms of the forms, the old forms and practices of the religious subculture, and the ways that if something is old and still here, it manifests a stability, an internal coherence that doesn't self-destruct in the way that John Vervaeke was talking about. And they founded a group called the Gospel Coalition. Now, you can find lots of videos online about the Gospel Coalition, and there are lots of people that were a part of it. This guy, Kevin DeYoung, very prominent pastor, was a pastor in Lansing, Michigan, was a pastor of the Reformed Church of America, a sister denomination to the Christian Reformed Church, left that denomination. I don't remember if he went PCA or what, but here he's asked in 2014, what is the new Calvinism? And, well, let's hear what he has to say.
So, Kevin, what is the new Calvinism?
What is the new Calvinism?
It's a resurgence of Reformed theology, mainly in soteriology, the 5 points, although not ever.
See, now, almost everything he's saying in here is insider talk. And so many of you listening to this won't ring true for any of you. This is all stuff within Christians. And here you've got Al Mohler, who's the president of a Southern Baptist seminary. And this has been one of the big stories in Christian subculture where the Reformed movement has been colonizing Baptists. And Al Mohler has been a big player in this.
Everyone in the New Calvinism would adhere to all 5 points, but mainly it's a new sense, especially among young people, I think, that God's sovereignty is biblical.
Lincoln Duncan, another important figure in this movement.
And massively important, that God loved us before we loved him, that he's the one who does the deciding work in our salvation.
Now, most of what you hear Kevin DeYoung say are beliefs, just like John Vervaeke was talking about. And beliefs, and he's framing this between Christian subcultures that different within the church in North America, certain Christians are taking on a new identity separate from other Christians based on all of this belief language. I tend to think that DeYoung I understand why he's saying the words he's saying here, but what he's trying to do is articulate other stuff, transformations that have been going on beneath the surface, underground, and he's trying to articulate them and represent them in words. But I actually don't think that whereas it's very true that people come up through and you can plot their transformations by their acceptance of these words. That's how you can plot the change. But as Vervaeke's trying to suss out, what is that change? Something has happened, something significant enough in these people's lives has brought them to probably disassociate from one community, one church, reassociate with another church, or in fact leverage one's agency, like Al Mohler, who's a seminary president, to begin moving the language of a subculture from one established sets of beliefs to another set of beliefs. And so something real is happening there. And I don't actually think it's the best way to tag these things and track these things is with the doctrine. I think it has much more to do with, I think you can learn much more by watching the celebrity preachers and noting the identity psychotechnologies that they are employing. And I think you could actually hear some of this in the language of David Nasser, because I think what's been happening is in fact so influential that it's even going beyond the language labeled boundaries of, let's say, the Gospel Coalition and continuing to bleed out into the rest of evangelicalism. And that basically is how transformations take place in communities. So to do that, I want to go to one of the three main founders of this, and a guy that I studied for quite a while, similar to what I'm doing now with Jordan Peterson, because I noted that Tim Keller, he's the pastor, he's retired now, he was the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, and he was a guy who came to New York City, a very secular place, and within the scope of about 20 years, started a church that grew to about 5,000 members in Manhattan, New York City, and helped launch a church planting movement that has been planting churches in urban areas all around the developed world. Now, that's a significant thing because, again, people keep asking me, well, why did you start studying Jordan Peterson? And the reason I started studying Jordan Peterson was because I noted that in the wake of Jordan Peterson, what was a one-way street, people started coming back from it. And I said, there's something important. Well, same with Tim Keller. Well, it was a one-way street, the secularization process. In a place like New York City, Tim Keller was changing by listening to, by preaching, and I think in some ways similar to Jordan Peterson, people who identified as secular now were expressing, bearing witness to a transformation of their hearts and lives into a religious framework. And, well, you say, well, as a pastor, why should you study that? What, in Sacramento, California? That is what I should be studying. I mean, well, what else should I be studying but these people that can help secular people become religious people? That's my job. So I studied Tim Keller because Tim Keller was doing it. Well, how do you know he was doing it? He had a church of 5,000 people in New York City, and listen to the testimonies. Again, similar to Jordan Peterson. I think on a smaller scale, but yeah, significant. And then what he helped found. Piper was in Minneapolis. To me, that wasn't as interesting because Minneapolis is, you're kind of in the Lutheran belt there up in Minneapolis. John Piper did some really interesting things with some really clever twists and his Christian hedonism. And I know a lot of people don't like them because of their conservative leanings on this and that. But here's the thing. If you're too picky about the distasteful things, the things that you find distasteful in other people's politics or religion, well, then all you're going to wind up looking at is your own self in the mirror. So you've got to go out and look at people who disagree with you in small and large ways if you, in fact, continue to want to learn and be productive in your learning. In this talk that Tim Keller gave, I think in 2015, and I've listened to a lot of talks like this by Tim Keller, he's telling people how to transform people in their seats. This is the provocation that John Vervaeke is pointing to. And in fact, Tim Keller has been, as has Jordan Peterson, have been enormously successful in changing people in their seats. And Tim Keller kind of came up before YouTube and a lot of MP3s. I've listened to hundreds of hours of Tim Keller on MP3. And so, he's a Christian minister, so it's not like he's, keeping his secrets to himself. He's trying to share his secrets with guys like me. This is Tim Keller colonizing me and saying, this is how you too, now pay attention here because the word is important, the gospel coalition. What happened in the gospel coalition movement is that this word gospel, which has been around a long time, began to take on a very specific sense. And Keller and Piper and others were incredibly disciplined in articulating what this word means and how it changes. But now as I play this video of Tim Keller, I want you to pay attention to identity and real. All right? So let's listen to Tim.
They need to be directed toward God. And what that means...
Now again, when he says they need to be directed towards God, that's exactly the language that David Nasser and Liberty University were using with Jordan Peterson. But what David Nasser and Liberty University didn't do is what Tim Keller is about to do now, which is, and what that means. Well, why does Tim Keller always go and what that means? Because Tim Keller was a pastor in New York City, and he understood very well that if you start by saying they need to be directed towards God, and all the secular people of New York City are going to say, I have no idea what that means. And what that means, and he's going to put it in other words, because he is trying to provoke a transformation. That's what preachers are supposed to do.
Is what you really are is basically what you love the most. And using the word love here, not so much just an emotion. Essentially, it's not your beliefs, at least not the beliefs you subscribe to, that actually makes you what you are.
Where have you heard that before? Vervaeke just said it. Peterson just said it. Peterson says it all the time. And you saw Tim Keller wince. There's a tell, because he knows he's talking to a confessional audience, an audience that is working to get people to the point of saying the sinner's prayer, to say the magic words, to say the holy words, to have them do that. And that's not unimportant, okay? Because that's going to be important in terms of this. We don't have identity without these communal things, because our identities are always located within communities. And so words are important things that tie us to that. And words are the ways that we can identify community. They're one of the only tools that we can actually track all this stuff, but they have limits. And that's what all of these people are saying.
Essentially, it's not your beliefs, at least not the beliefs you subscribe to, that actually makes you what you are. It's what your heart trusts in, what your heart loves the most.
Now again, we're just swapping one words for another. And some of you say, well, I don't know that the second group of words, what your heart subscribes to. Well, now we're going to actually reach back, and those of you who know who James K. Smith is, philosopher at Calvin College, I've mentioned him in previous videos, his book, Desiring the Kingdom. But we're going all the way back to Augustine. And via Augustine, we're going all the way back to, stuff is old. It's been around. That's why it's good to study old things.
You are. At least not the beliefs you subscribe to that actually makes you what you are. It's what your heart trusts in, what your heart loves the most. You can say, I believe in God. God is this, and God is this, and God is this. And yet, your heart is basically based in your career. We all know how that works. Your heart is actually trusting in.
He smiles there because he often makes a point that this is one of the defining sins of pastors, because we establish, and this is what they mean by gospel, we establish our status on our performance in the world. So if I have a big church, I feel good about myself. If a lot of people subscribe to my YouTube channel, I feel good about myself. If a lot of people write me emails, I feel good about myself. And in fact, my status defines who I am. And what Keller's going to do is say, there's something else over here that defines you much more. And actually that is God. And now we get into the psychotechnology of the Gospel Coalition.
Career, your career. We all know how that works. Your heart is actually trusting in career. Your mind is saying, no, I trust in Jesus for my salvation. I trust in Jesus for this and that and all that. But where's your heart? Jonathan Edwards, who was a great Augustinian, therefore said that if you're going to be thoroughly biblical, you must not pit knowledge and feeling against each other. That if you say, I know I should be generous with my money, but I'm just not doing it, he would say, well, there's a sense in which you know what you should do, but you're not doing it. But there's another sense in which you don't really know what you should do. Let me give you an example. This isn't, excuse me, I'm better than I was yesterday, but not as better as I'd like it to be. When I was a pastor in Virginia many years ago, I had a young girl in my church, and she was she's about 15 years old, I guess. And she was discouraged, she was depressed often. And at one point, and the family was a prominent family in the church, and I tried to help the family with her. At one point, she came into my study and we were talking. And being a young minister, I was a little bit naive, and I said, well, how are you feeling? She was downcast. And she said, well, you're a Christian, aren't you? Oh, yes, I'm a Christian. And Christians have many blessings, don't they? Oh, yes, we do. And so we counted the blessings a little bit, about the great things that as a Christian she could count on, and she knew was happening there, and all those great things in her life. But at one point I said, so you're still depressed? And she said, I tried to encourage her, but here's what she said, almost literally. Yes, I know that Jesus loves me, I know he saved me, and I know he's going to take me to heaven. But what good is all that when not a single boy at school will even look at you? Now, I don't know why more of you aren't laughing at that. What she was saying is, yeah, I'm saved. Yes, I'm going to heaven forever. Yes, I'm a daughter of the King. Yes, I'm going to be glorified. I'm justified, sanctified, glorified, and all that. But you know what? I'm in ninth grade, 10th grade, and there's not a single boy will ask me out. Now, here's what Jonathan Edwards would say. He would say she had the opinion that God loved her, but she had no real knowledge that God loved her. Because the love of boys was more real to her heart than the love of God, or she wouldn't have been depressed. And so in one sense, you could say, what she just needed to be told, well, what did she need to be told? See, what Edwards would say is she needed to be shown the love of God in such a way that it began to get more real to her heart, and it began to balance out how popular she was or unpopular she was.
Notice the language of real, okay? It's more real to you. Now we're into the axial age stuff. What is the real world? What really are we talking about?
Some years ago, one more before I talk about how to do it. Some years ago, I won't mention, I had a relative who never would wear a seatbelt. And every time I talked to him, he would get in the car and he wouldn't wear a seatbelt. And we all would nag him about wearing a seatbelt. All right, he put his seatbelt on. And one day we went to see him and got in the car and he put his seatbelt on right away. And we said, "Woo, what happened to you?" And he said, I went to a friend of mine, a couple of weeks ago, I went to see a friend of mine in the hospital. He was in a car crash and he went through the windshield and he had like 200 stitches in his face. And for some strange reason, ever since then, I've been having no problem, buckling up. And I talked to him a little bit about that. What was interesting going on was I said, well, did you get new information? What changed you?
Information.
Did you not know that people go through the windshield? Did you not? And what happened was an abstract proposition became connected to an actual sensory experience. That is something he saw. And there's some place where Jonathan Edwards, the whole idea behind preaching to the heart, is some point where Jonathan Edwards says it's only when you attach, it's only when you actually attach an abstract truth to some kind of sensory experience that you've had, or at least the memory of a sensory experience that you have. I'm going to show you how to do this in a second. That something that you know is true becomes real to you. And the point of preaching to the heart is to take abstract truth and to make it real to people's heart so that they are changed. A lot of us would like it if people took notes from our sermons or our talks and then went out into the world and started to change their life. But what I'm telling you is, and Jonathan Edwards never spoke that much about preaching, but in one of his books, Thoughts on Revival, he actually says about preaching that preaching does not change you by giving people information that then they go out and practice as much as it changes you through the impression it's made during the sermon. What he means is this: if that girl is sitting in under preaching, that 16-year-old girl, who's, by the way, probably in her 50s now. But anyway, that 16-year-old girl is sitting under preaching, and the love of God through Jesus Christ in a sermon becomes so vividly real to her and so starts to affect her. We're talking about the affections. And it starts to penetrate to the heart.
Now, this is all language within a subculture, okay? And I completely understand. Some of you are listening to that, and some of you are getting triggered, which is why I play the Buddhist stuff first, because this stuff will trigger you. The Buddhist stuff won't trigger you, but we're talking about similar things. And even if you look at the subtleties of language, sitting under preaching, and this we cannot represent these things without words. Language is the best way we can do it, and we're trying to represent let's use language from a different room over here, because if I use my Christian language, I trigger a bunch of you. I'll use Vervaeke's language. Transformations of consciousness. That's what we're talking about. You said, well, I thought you were talking about personal conversions. Yep. Transformations of consciousness. Personal conversion. Well, See, and I know some of you are worried. Oh, Vanderklay's getting syncretistic. He's. I'm not walking over that line at all. I'm changing the language. But the language marks the boundaries. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Which means you have to be very careful about which ones. Okay. So, and you also have to understand what belief in God, what we're talking about with those words. And, again, how did I get onto this whole crazy Jordan Peterson thing that I've been, brought me to the ends of the earth in the case of Australia? Because I noticed that people were being transformed. And you may say, well, Pastor. Well, yeah. Well, have you listened to the conversations? People are being transformed in a Christian way. And he says, I don't like to say whether or not I believe in God. How is a guy who says that doing things that lead people to be transformed in a Christian way? Well, that's the question. Go back to Jordan Peterson's March question and answer. What question should reporters be asking him? What the hell is going on? That's the question. Before I studied Jordan Peterson, I studied Tim Keller. Studied him for the same reason. Because I saw Tim Keller transforming people in the seats. Before I studied Tim Keller, I studied Bill Hybels. Not quite as intensively. Because I'd go to Willow Creek and see people are getting transformed right there in the seats. And transformed for the better. And well, Pastor, you're just playing your tribal game. No. Because I would hear people tell the kind of story that Tim York told and look up his talk with me. And the kind of people that the kind of stories that Job tells. Look up his talks with me. I mean, I'm putting them all out there so you can see the transformations. And the people themselves are saying, it's for the better. Well, what do you mean it's for the better? I'm not depressed anymore. My life is happier. Well, I thought you're supposed to move them to heaven. Yeah, now we're going to get into a much longer conversation about what I think Christianity actually is and the relationship between heaven and earth and the reconciliation of heaven and earth.
And she starts to say, why am I all that upset about whether this or that stupid boy like me or not when I've got this kind of love? See, when that sort of thing starts happening in her heart, she's being changed on the spot. She's being changed during the sermon. She's being changed because the preaching has reached her heart. And so
now you have to listen to before this to understand what he means by heart, because he's reaching back into a long biblical tradition. And when he uses that, he's using it as a shortcut term, okay? And I don't expect you to necessarily understand what he's talking about. If you really want to understand, watch the whole video. And there's plenty that you can debate in terms of the use of that word, but that's how it's working in the context of the talk.
So as Alec Mateer said, I started the talk this way. What Alec Mateer is trying to say, it's not enough for you to take a text and say, okay, I need to show that this text teaches that Jesus Christ sacrificed for us and loved us with a costly love, okay? And that's the text. It's not enough just to say, I need to expound that accurately. I need to bring that home to people's hearts in such a way that it changes them in the seats. And so their hearts are affected by it, and the other things that are more real to their heart than the love of Jesus become Jesus' love starts to displace that.
That word displace is really important because he harkens back to a Puritan who talked about the fact that when something, let's go back to addiction, when something like addiction is in our heart, in order for something to displace it, you need something more powerful to come and push it out. You heard Jordan Peterson say to David Nasser, it's often religious conversion that pushes out addiction. And Jordan Peterson says, AA capitalized on it. You need something more powerful. Then you begin to say, well, what do you mean by power? Is it power in terms of physics, like a nuclear reactor or an 8-cylinder engine? No, that's not the kind of physical power. It's another kind of power. Well, and people say, well, it's spiritual power. And I say, I'll watch those words that fudge. I'm going to want you to what do you mean by spiritual? Because in a sense, when you say spiritual power, you're almost begging the question in terms of what spirit really means. But another power comes in and transforms it and provokes the change. And as a preacher who wants to be a better preacher, obviously a not terribly effective preacher given the size of my flock, well, I want to learn. And where am I going to learn from? I'm going to learn from people that are doing it. And so I pay attention to watch. I want to see who's getting transformed. Now, I see lots of powers that are transforming people. Alcohol can transform people's lives. And we all say, well, alcohol transformed his life for the worse. Heroin transformed their life for the worse. Video games transformed their life for the worse. Pornography transformed their life for the worse. What about these things that transform lives for the better? Well, how can we know better? Well, we navigate by the stars, right? And in the box of secularism, it's really hard to navigate because we navigate by ends, by telos, and the iron box of secularism makes that very, very difficult. Well, if you begin with metaphysics and then you go to epistemology and then you go to axiology, there's kinds of a natural progression that goes there, and it actually works. It works pretty well. But the whole thing is about real. Well, what is more real? And again, go back to the introduction to I think it was 11.
To get into and continue the discussion of these higher states of consciousness. So if you remember,
higher states of consciousness. Well, what do you mean by higher? It's a transformed state of consciousness that somehow when our consciousness gets transformed, it yields a better life. And let's give Sam Harris some due here, because a little bit of A/B testing, drunken on the couch all the time, or able to relate to my children and go to work and have a productive marriage. Yeah, that's better. Waster and living in my mother's basement covered with Cheetos dust, playing video games all the time, or actually building a career and having community and doing, yep, that's better. And that comes through transformations of consciousness. And how can those things? Well, a lot of it depends on that which is more real, but how do you define what's real? And physicalism that says, well, the most real thing is this thing right here. And I would say, no, the more real thing is that which colonizes the matter. It's that which forms the matter. Okay? It's the formal cause is far more real than the little plastic earbud holder.
Remember, they're very problematic, but that they're at the core of many of the axial age world religions and foundational philosophies. This is the idea that people have an alternative state of consciousness that they regard as somehow more real than their everyday state of consciousness.
And the little girl, well, what was more real for the little girl? Well, that the other ninth graders and the boys, the ninth grade boys, it was very real for her as she desired a narrative where there'll be a man and she'll become a wife and there'll be children and there'll be a house and there'll be a car and there'll be a garden and there'll be grandchildren. Well, so identity and narrative, there it is. And that was very real to her. And Keller, through Jonathan Edwards, all the way back, is saying, well, there's something more real to her. And in fact, the way it usually works is, well, maybe she'll get the guy eventually, and then she'll get the house, and then she'll get the child, and then all of that. And at some point she'll say, is this all there is? There's something more real. And now we're back to Augustine, who said that the guy and the marriage and the child and the white picket fence and the home and the car and the retirement fund and the grandkids, all of the goodness that you tasted in there actually pointed to another world. And there was a source that these things drew from. And that source is God. God. We've been telling this story for a very long time.
That's problematic precisely because we tend to judge realness by how well we get an overall coherence in our intelligibility, how we're making sense of things. But in these altered states that are very different from our everyday consciousness and therefore do not cohere with it, people do the alternative. Instead of rejecting it the way we reject dreaming, for example, because it doesn't cohere with our everyday experience, people reject the everyday experience as illusory, and they say that this state of consciousness somehow gives them an improved access to reality. And as you remember, as we've been going through the axial age revolution and the sense of wisdom and meaning that is attendant upon it, this ability to transcend through illusion and get connected to what is more real is central to what wisdom means, and having some deep sense of connectedness to reality is also central to what it is to regard one's life as authentically meaningful.
Now, when we go back to the little girl, one might say, well, somehow along the way, even this little 15-year-old girl, something impressed upon her the fact that she should probably sacrifice and find that man and pursue that family and commit to that man and put her life at risk in having those children and commit to giving those children as good a home as she could and on and on and on and on and on and all those things. Well, the formal cause that is actually creating this life, well, there's meaning in there. And even when she begins to actualize this dream that had been passed into her, Jordan Peterson-esque, for, countless generations that had been built into her culture via Western civilization and all of this stuff, that there's still a longing for something. And then you get into some of C.S. Lewis's argument from Desire, where she's longing for an ideal husband, and the guy she marries is going to fall short, and she's longing for an ideal home, and the home that she creates is going to fall short, and then something else comes in, other stories come in, and you can begin to see how the matter of the wood in the home and the bookshelves and the plastics and the money, all there's something it's pursuing. And it's something she's never seen, but yet she has a hunger for it. And this is always all playing out. Now, I want to go back to our friend Paul Maxwell, because we stopped at Hegel, because we're going to move with Hegel, we begin the migration towards the bloody postmodernists, and we're going to see some of where this goes.
G.W.F. Hegel, who came in the 19th century to critique Kant. And his basic critique is that Kant's noumenal-phenomenal distinction doesn't actually solve the disagreement between Descartes and Hume, but actually fortifies the tension and is even more problematic for us. It traps people in the phenomenal and locks them out of any justified knowledge of the noumenal world.
Locks them out of the noumenal world. We can't get at metaphysics. We don't know what's behind the real world. And so Hegel's going to take his shot at it.
Real world. So Hegel argued that ultimate reality makes itself known to the world through rationality. But the way it makes itself known is unique to Hegel. Okay, so Hegel argues that rationality ushers the noumenal world into our world progressively through dialectic. What does that mean? What this means is that one generation of humankind may hold to a particular idea. That idea could be called a thesis about the way the world works. Then the next generation rebels and comes up with like an opposing idea, right? And that idea is called the antithesis. So you have the thesis from the first generation, the antithesis from the second generation. Then the third generation rebels against the second generation and combines the strengths of both theses into a synthesis. So you've got thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. Then the fourth generation rebels against the third generation, and the third generation synthesis becomes the new thesis, and the fourth generation proposes an antithesis. Then the fifth generation rebels against the fourth generation and proposes a new synthesis, and so on. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and that is called the dialectic, and so on and so forth, right? This is called in Hegel the rational dialectic. Pure reason, in a sense, is a future reality that is pulling us toward itself through the dialectic like a black hole. Reason is inevitable. The dialectic is pushing us forward, it is propelling us to a place in time in history before us, in front of us, prospectively, that will be perfectly reasonable. And the human race is becoming inevitably and unstoppably more reasonable. And it is through reason that the world will be saved. And all individuals will, on the last day, think the same way and have the same perspective and hold the same opinions.
Now, notice the concept of salvation. Notice the eschatology. Notice the world will be saved when everything will be one. And, of course, Hegel thinks he can see the one.
And the noumenal and the phenomenal worlds will be identical. However,
in a sense, that's a philosophical version of the reconciliation of heaven and earth. And if you don't understand how Hegelian progressivist ideologies and philosophies are, relate to Christianity and other axial age, well, it's all the same thing.
We must resist the notion that we are perfectly reasonable today, according to Hegel, because
and you can hear some Sam Harris in there, can't you? Because it's this rationalism that's going to fix it all up.
Opinions, then the noumenal and the phenomenal worlds will be identical. However, we must resist the notion that we are perfectly reasonable today, according to Hegel, because to suggest that we are dogmatic,
sounds like total depravity,
correct today, is to fall into the trap of believing that no antithesis will come, that our beliefs will never be falsified, which is to fall into the error of the pre-moderns in Hegel's view. So Hegel thought Christianity is the most rational expression of the noumenal realm today, and for that reason ought to be believed, so we should all be Christians, but we must hold in principle that it will be overcome and antithesized in the future, and therefore ought to be held in an open hand. So Hegel thought that the human race was born in a religious state. That was the first thesis, and was liberated from that state through objective ethical thinking, and will one day be rescued from merely ethical thinking into a bliss of pure aesthetic enjoyment through the rational dialectic. So he's saying all the human race began in this religious state, moved to ethical, and is moving to is moving to aesthetic. So it goes from religious to ethical to aesthetic. Not only is that the biography of the human race, it is the biography of each man. And the way that he enlightens himself, the way he liberates himself, is to liberate himself from the religious through ethical thinking, and to liberate himself through the ethical thinking into aesthetic thinking. And the reason that the aesthetic no longer requires ethics is because when everybody thinks the same way, ethics won't be required. Reason will bring us all together. And in this way, Hegel saw the world unfolding in three acts as the path every man ought to journey for himself. He is born stupid and religious and grows into an ethical state, and through reason learns to achieve existential bliss. And Hegel gave birth to two movements, his defenders and his detractors. And his defenders believed that the world ought to move in a more homogeneous direction in which all individuals eventually meld into a single perspective, where everything is the same and individuality is not important. And obviously Hegel is in this way the root of Marxism. Detracting from Hegel are those who thought that individuality was the essence of rationality, and to be an individual was the irreducible element of being reasonable. And in that sense, Hegel's detractors conceived Hegel as the opposite of rationality. And this detraction was represented most famously by Scruton and Kierkegaard, who argued that Hegel had the three acts of the world and of the human life exactly backwards, in the exact opposite order. So Kierkegaard argued that aesthetic enjoyment is not the sophisticated highest tier of human existence, but is rather the mental state of the infant, kind of drooling, blissful and aesthetic bliss, right? According to his own mind, he's correct, right? Then man exits the aesthetic infantile stage of his life and enters the ethical. And then he achieves the highest tier, the religious mode of existence, which is not the infantile stage as Hegel proposes, but the most sophisticated stage is the religious mode of existence, which is a man's authentic encounter with God as an individual, right? And in that state, in the religious state, he recognizes that God has the right to do whatever he wants with him. It is only in this state of individuality, which Kierkegaard calls authenticity, that a man can be reasonable and ethical and properly celebrate the true beauty of the world as that to which he is not entitled. And in this existential age, one ethical entailment is that moral principles have been relativized. And in the rejection of Kant through Hegelianism, Hume's dictum, "you can't get from is to ought," haunted the world, and the human race pondered the potential consequences of a modernist view of the world that couldn't justify a universal conception of the good as Socrates had defended thousands of years earlier. So we moved from premodernism, which is a way of looking at the world that prioritizes metaphysics, to modernism, which is a way of looking at the world that prioritizes epistemology, now to postmodernism. And postmodernism front loads not the metaphysical or epistemological, but the axiological. Okay? And postmodernism was rooted in Hegelian existentialism, but was jolted into existence by the Holocaust. And many philosophers, such as Emanuel Levinas and Martin Buber, saw the Nazi Party as representative of the inevitable consequence of the Enlightenment. They philosophized that modernism's inability to see metaphysical realities, their disenchantment with the world, allowed the Nazis to dehumanize the Jews, because the Nazis were slaved to a myth of rationality that was in reality a way of masking their attempt to gain political power. It is the entailment of losing sight of the noumenal realm altogether, which is a product of Kantianism. So, philosophy had two options in the 21st century to prevent another Holocaust: to go back to premodernism and give human beings dignity through acknowledging their metaphysical value, such as the soul, or abandon metaphysics entirely and front-load axiology, that is, front-load one's...
Now, right there, you see a lot of what's going on, and I think Paul is right there at that split.
Ethical abandon beings' dignity through acknowledging their metaphysical value.
When you listen to Jordan Peterson, when he talks about the spark of divine, when he talked to Margaret Hoover right there, the spark of the divine and all of that, well, go back to the axial age. Human beings have that. We've got to double down on that. But Peterson does that as a modernist, okay? But who's he fighting? Bloody postmodernism. It's right there. Right there's the divide.
Such as the soul, or abandon metaphysics entirely and front-load axiology, that is, front-load one's ethical responsibility to one's neighbor and to pursue global justice. Then epistemology simply becomes a tool in defending and fortifying that pursuit of justice. And in this way, postmodernism is always on the hunt for the agenda behind truth claims. Postmodernism sees any claim to objective truth as a veiled attempt to gain power over another human being by persuading them to submit to their way of seeing the world, because again, world after Kant, there's no such thing in the as the noumenal. All we have is perception. Therefore, all we have to protect those around us is to front load the human dignity of each person with no metaphysical basis, to front load your ethical obligation to equity, to perfect global equity, and then to make sense of the world after the fact. And we must recognize here that postmodernism did not originate the claim that we do not have access to objective truth. That was Kant, who fortified the distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. And all that needed to occur for the relationship between those worlds to be broken is for some event to occur which casts enough suspicion on the transcendental that Kant posited to distrust it, to distrust the sausage maker. And that event was the Holocaust. And once you're stuck in the phenomenal world with no trustworthy transcendental to mediate the noumenal world to you, and people are acting as if human dignity doesn't exist, you're stuck with subjectivity and an ethical absolute. And in this way, the task of philosophy becomes the establishment of global justice, not because people were eager to abandon truth, but because through Descartes, Hume, and Kant, people became blind to metaphysics and therefore blind to the necessary theological foundations which exist at the very bottom of every philosophical question.
There it is. There it is.
And postmodernism is not an eager pursuit of relativism, although maybe it has become that in some circles, but a desperate scramble to minimize the ethical damages that secularism has wreaked on the world through an unchecked Enlightenment modernism.
And there's the fight of the IDW.
And today, we exist not so much in a postmodern age, but in an age of competing modernities. People don't know how to become enchanted with the metaphysical world again, even though they want to.
There's the meaning crisis.
Modernity, and today is that secularism has wreaked on the world through an unchecked Enlightenment modernism. And today, we exist not so much in a postmodern age, but in an age of competing modernities. People don't know how to become enchanted with the metaphysical world again, even though they want to. People are grasping towards something more than materialism, but they can't attain it because the structure of modernity requires them to begin with epistemology, which or even worse, a postmodernity, which requires them to front load and begin with an unjustified axiology, which dictates a principle of radical doubt, which will never allow the justification of metaphysics ever. So what direction should we go?
And Paul Maxwell is a Christian, so he's going to tell you,
how can we become enchanted with the world again? Should we not all just become pre-Socratics again and start from scratch and start claiming all is fire, all is water? Certainly not. As the Judeo-Christian worldview emphasizes, the only way to begin with metaphysics is not to speculate about the metaphysical world, but to have the metaphysical world actually reach out to you. And Christians have historically called this metaphysical point of contact revelation. God actually deigns to reach down into the material world and manifest himself.
and those of you who are listening, right at that moment, then he turns to the other language. He turns to the religious language. And, it's very interesting the way Peterson looks at religious language and how often he notes that for certain of his patients, the only way they could find healing down below in terms of AB, your little AB testing within the box of secularism, is to go to theological language. And you'd hear him do that with David Nasser and with respect to alcoholism. And so on one hand, of course, you're talking to a Christian, you're listening to a Christian pastor. I've got my agenda, I've got my presuppositions. I'm not going to play that I'm somehow objective in this. I'm not. And David Nasser says, it works. And Peterson says, well, if it works. And you'd hear Tim Keller switch over to this language. And so, and I think, again, what I appreciate is that just because the language works doesn't mean that we shouldn't study it, which is what Vervaeke's doing. He's studying the language, and he's sitting right there at that moment of crisis of that I think Paul Maxwell nicely laid out. And, what do? Can we go back to the axial age? Is that possible? How do we get out of this?
To you. And Christians have historically called this metaphysical point of contact revelation. God actually deigns to reach down into the material world and manifest himself to those who will accept his self-witness. And much more could be said about the relationship between philosophy and theology and the complex ways that philosophy has bearing upon our cultural moment. But for the purpose of keeping the summary as short as possible, the doctrine of revelation is as good a place as any to conclude this comprehensive survey of the entire history of philosophy. There you go.
I like that little video. But yeah, doctrine of revelation. And so in a sense, then we're right back there with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson arguing about whether or not something can be revealed. Now I'm heading towards Easter Sunday. Easter is the biggest sermon of the year for a pastor, Christian pastor usually. So all week long, I'm thinking about my sermon. I'm going to talk a lot about resurrection, obviously. But big question about about resurrection is, in fact, in what way is resurrection revelatory? What does it reveal? And revelation, our English word, is usually what we use to translate the Greek word apocalypse, which means an unveiling, a pulling the curtain aside to see what is true, what is the metaphysical, the thing which is colonizing and informing the matter. Jordan Peterson in this is a classic modernist. His coyness about his personal beliefs is the posture of the naked public square that has been the default position from the mid 20th century, where you if you're in the public square, you speak in science and reason, and you might have personal religious beliefs, but you keep them over here. And, even, I'm not criticizing when I say it. I mean, Dallas Willard, if you look at C.S. Lewis, two prominent Christian evangelists and apologists who taught in secular universities, and their students would always testify that in the context of the secular university, they never pushed their Christianity on them. In fact, they went out of their way to be fair to non-Christian and students of other religion, to respect them. And I think there are actually theological reasons and justifications for that. So this coyness in the public realm, but Peterson in some ways has kind of taken a step over the line to become a preacher. And so then that makes the coyness all the more remarkable. But his axiology is based on a Darwinian epistemology, which puts him at odds with the truth correspondence modernist foundationalists, such as someone like, let's say, Sam Harris. And then he says, we need God, in quotes, for psychology. Now, I want to bring in Owen Barfield. There's a wonderful book written by Philip and Carol Zaleski called The Fellowship, The Literary Lives of the Inklings. J.R.R. Tolkien, Owen Barfield, C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams. Most of you are probably most familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Owen Barfield, well, I'll just read this paragraph. The radical idea that words carry such hidden cargo is elaborated in a second essay that Barfield published 2 years later in the London Mercury in December 1922. He began his piece, Ruin, by quoting with approval Maupassant's declaration that words have a soul. I won't try reading French. I didn't grow up in Canada. I've had 0 French classes. Words have a soul. What on earth does that mean? First of all, we're in this particular moment, we're kind of at a loss of how to describe what a soul is. And Jordan Peterson got that question. I thought his answer was very interesting. My definition of a soul is when you say, way back when they tried to, at the beginning of the physical age, they put a body on a sensitive scale and wait for it to die and see if the body lost matter. Could they weigh the soul? That's kind of like asking, can you weigh a story? If I am probably best conceived of as even story isn't the best word for it, but it's maybe the closest we've got. If I am a story, my soul is probably the story. Okay, and my story inhabits this body, and it moves through time, and it colonizes things. I'm colonizing you now through my video. Be colonized, and so I am a story, and I am a soul, and in Christianity, I believe that what happens in my resurrection is that God actually reforms the material universe, and in my resurrected body, my story is reincarnated in flesh that does not decay. All right. But what Owen Barfield noted was that words have a soul. Well, what on earth did he mean by that? He meant that words, sort of like my body. There's a few little scars on my body that I'm not going to show you. Mercifully, they're nothing really to tell about. I love that scene in Jaws where they're all comparing scars, and these scars tell stories. And Jesus, even after his resurrection, his new body bears the scars, and so he invites Thomas to put his hand there and put his hand in his side. And, well, words have souls. Well, what do you mean by that? Words carry with them, Owen Barfield believes, evidence of consciousness. We usually attribute words with consciousness. Evidence of consciousness, and Owen Barfield believed that the transformations of consciousness throughout time, communally in terms of culture, was that transformation, the artifacts of that transformation were found in the history of words. Owen Barfield was a philologist. So, and you can read about this in this book, and you can also read about Tolkien and Lewis and such. So he worked on this word ruin, making industrious use of the Oxford English Dictionary. He then bared the soul of the English word ruin. Now again, soul is almost story there. He bared the story of the English word ruin by exploring its etymology. Here one may note that Emerson declared in The Poet that language is the archive of history, and in Praise of Books that dictionaries are the raw material of possible poems and histories. And one wonders about the extent of the influence of Barfield, largely unacknowledged apart from scattered references in the latter 1931 poetic dictum and a few essays. Barfield finds in the Latin origin of ruin, ruio, a large sense of swift, disastrous movement. And you can sense that. That was their ruin. Whoosh! Job's family gets wiped out. They are ruined. This sense would not last. Ruin changes or evolves. Through the writings of Chaucer, Gower, Spenser, Shakespeare, in the latter writings it becomes a warm and living thing. And here's the fun thing, is that we can actually, through literature, we can sense the movement of this. You can feel ruin of its older sense. You can see it there, and then you can see in its middle sense. And later when we talk about the ancient ruins of the Greek theater there in Ephesus, let's say, or Corinth, we sense it. What a ruin is different from his ruin came upon him, and so we can begin to sense the soul, the story of the word ruin. Milton, Pope, Dryden, and others, each contributing to its shifting meaning to the import of the words four magical black squiggles wherein the past is bottled like an Arabian genie in the dark. By the late 18th century, with its Enlightenment, neoclassical, and satirical sensibilities, ruin had been bled of its original power, speed, and terror, becoming all tumble-down walls and mossy masonry. The case is exemplary. Ruin is but one of 10,000 ancestral words embalming the souls of many poets dead and gone and the souls of many common men. It is also, Barfield proclaimed, in an ending burning with eschatological fever, a word with a bright future. For all words, all language invented so that people can relate to one another are striving still towards that end and consolation. As language grows subtler and subtler, burying in its vaults more and more associations, more and more mind, it becomes to those same spirits a more and more perfect medium of companionship. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Skipping a little bit later, we can begin to see its intersectionality with the meaning crisis. By now, Barfield's evolutionary argument had advanced in complexity and detail. He believed that very early human beings had experienced a profound intimacy with the world, in which thoughts, feelings, and the objects of perceptions lay in healthy and proper relationship to one another. Sounds like a primeval garden. Barfield would later call this state original participation, that over centuries human beings had developed an acute self-awareness in which this primordial unity disappeared, resulting in the philosophical skepticism that afflicted modern times, and that the future which Barfield had tasted during his Sophia moment promised a return to our original experience of unity, while remaining the discernment and ability to think abstractly that they had acquired during our evolutionary odyssey. Poetic dictum focuses upon the place of language in this scheme. Barfield contends, let me go back. Primordial man, Barfield contends, possessed a poetic language drenched in meaning. He quotes with approval Shelley's famous line from In Defense of Poetry. In the infancy of society, every author is necessarily a poet because language itself is poetry. As consciousness evolved, this poetic language and the poetic experience of reality that it had made possible faded away. This is the crisis in which we find ourselves today. I think we're talking about the meaning crisis. Barfield's most impressive elaboration of his theory comes in his discussion of the Greek word pneuma, Latin spiritus. To Max Muller, the celebrated Victorian philologist and a principal target of Barfield's argument, pneuma originally meant wind. And if you've studied Greek New Testament, this is a word you're dealing with all the time. Originally meant wind. When the Greeks required an abstract word for the life principle, they simply appropriated the word pneuma and altered its meaning. Not so, counters Barfield. Pneuma and the words from which it derived meant neither breath, nor wind, nor spirit, nor yet all three of these things, but simply had their own peculiar meaning, which has since, in the world of the evolution of consciousness, crystallized into the three meanings specified, and no doubt into others also. The history of language is, then, a history of crystallization, of rigor mortis, of death and decay. So it appears at first glance. But this is illusory, for there exists in the history of language, and thus in the life of human beings, all of whom employ language to apprehend the world, a second life-giving force. The salvific force is poetry. The world can and will be saved by poets. The lost meaning of primordial language reappears under the conscious art of the poet, as metaphor, a recreating registering of thought, one of these eternal facts which may already have been experienced in perception. Poetry induces a felt change of consciousness. The felt was added at the suggestion of Lewis, who read the work in manuscript. This change is in effect a return, partially, though it may be, to the poetic richness of our primordial consciousness, but now in a state of full self-awareness. Metaphor is the catalyst for this felt change of consciousness. Every effective metaphor brings with it a more complete perception of the world and its interrelationships. It reveals more truth. It brightens, expands, clarifies. In effect, it helps create our understanding of the world. Through metaphor, we receive, in addition to the moment or moments of aesthetic pleasure in appreciation, a more permanent boon. It is as though our own consciousness has actually been expanded, as Barfield promised. In his book offered a theory of, his book offered a theory of knowledge. Poetry and its metaphors are means of cognition. Now, my normal everyday experience as a human being of the world around me depends entirely upon what I bring to the sense datum from within. The absorption of this metaphor into my imagination has enabled me to bring more than I could before. It has created something in me, a faculty or part of a faculty, enabling me to observe what I could not hitherto observe. This ability to recognize significant resemblances and analogies considered as in action, I shall call knowledge. Considered as a state, and apart from the effort by which it is imparted and acquired, I shall call it wisdom. So Barfield imagines that what I experience right now, sitting as Paul Vanderklay, son of Stan and Barb, grew up in a black community and a Dutch Reformed church at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, time in the Dominican Republic, years now in Sacramento, in a particular congregation, in a particular marriage, with particular children, reading particular books, listening to particular videos, making videos of my own, on and on and on. The consciousness, this thing that I have as consciousness, is not just this biological thing, biological function, such as the electricity that a battery or a generator puts out, but is shaped and molded by Jordan Peterson with Sam Harris, all of those years of shaping and molding that has happened in our past. That has been built into me in terms of the hardware, built into me in terms of the software. And in fact, this consciousness is formed and shaped by the story verse that is around me. It can't be any other way. I don't see, as Sam Harris would imagine, through clear eyes, through some monarchical vision, seeing a world of objects. That's not how we look. That's not how we see things. It's shaped and molded. And in fact, if you wonder about the history of consciousness, well, where would we find out about it? Through words. Words have souls. People have souls. Now, Peterson, for all his coyness about believing in God, doesn't exhibit the same coyness talking about the transcendent, which, if you've watched my videos about God number 1 and God number 2, God number 2. And in fact, a really interesting video where he talks with Roger Scruton at Cambridge, which all of this is now different because of course Scruton has had a bad time lately, and Peterson's invitation was withdrawn, and the other guy I think went on to teach at a university in the United States. This is now a very interesting conversation, partly because of everything that happened after. And notice how the things that happened after now shape our view of this video. I don't watch this. This is not the same video in a sense that I watched when I first watched it because of all the subsequent things that have happened in the lives of the people there. And now I watch it with new eyes. And in fact, now when I watch it, I pay more attention to this little introduction, which seemed to be a throwaway, but really isn't a throwaway at all. So let's watch that.
Of Ralston College and the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Platonism, it's an immense honour to introduce two of the foremost intellectuals of our age. These thinkers, one a philosopher, the other a psychologist, are spiritual writers addressing the malaise of the soul in our culture. John Stuart Mill, in his magnificent essay on Coleridge, wrote of Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, who above all others men have been led to ask themselves in regard to any ancient or received opinion, is it true? And by Coleridge,
remember Coleridge now.
What is the meaning? With Coleridge, in contrast to the utility of Bentham, the very fact that any doctrine had been believed by thoughtful men and received by whole nations and generations of mankind was part of the problem to be solved, was one of the phenomena to be accounted for. This, I think, is true of both Roger Scruton and Jordan Peterson. And I'd like to mention just a couple of points of convergence. One is an insistence on the importance of imagination as conversion to truth in opposition to a mere fantasy, and an opposition to ideology, as well as idolatry, especially the idolatrous ideology of the postmodern Foucault-derived consensus, and an urgent return to questions about truth, beauty, and goodness. And of course, part of this is linked to what both perceive as the perilous position of the modern university. They both argue that continuity of esteem needs to be regained in the humanities, and that the dominant strands of the humanities are leading to an impoverishment of the souls of students. Narratives, both argue, are not just stories of power, but these narratives persist because of their truth. So the importance for both Ralston College and indeed for the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Platonism of both of these thinkers is their insistence upon the relationship between mythos and logos, between story and reason, the insistence upon a hierarchy of values, and their vision of education as conversion to truth. This conversation will be moderated by the president of Ralston College, Stephen Blackwood.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Douglas, for those inspiring and grounding words, starting us off right in relation to the past that we wish to recover. Let me start, I think, with a very straightforward but perhaps difficult question. We're gathered around the theme, apprehending the transcendent, loosely to gather this conversation. And I'd like to begin by asking each of you, what is the transcendent? What does it mean for something to be transcendent?
What is the transcendent? Do you believe in God? What is the transcendent? The words matter. Somehow we're more comfortable talking about the transcendent.
Well, if you let me start. I take a position which I attribute also to Kant, that we have a very clear negative understanding of it. We, as it were, advance to the edge of our thinking in so many areas, knowing that although there's nothing further that we can say, that somehow the truth has nevertheless not run out. So that negative view, I think, needs to be combined with a more positive view, which tells us that there are other ways, maybe not thinking, but some other way of crossing that boundary and, as it were, landing in the realm of the transcendent and knowing it from inside. I think, and that.
Now, you've got the objective and the subjective there. Crossing that boundary, knowing it from the inside.
This is something that we understand very quickly in personal relations.
Now notice the relationship between the transcendent and the subjective and the personal. And I think it was Alvin Plantinga, God and other minds. The transcendent is a mind. Because it looks, it transcends, but it looks, and it has that capacity. And I love what Scruton does right here.
That when I address you, I know that I'm addressing something which addresses me too.
I'm addressing an agent. Well, how do I know you have consciousness? How do I know you have this capacity to transcend? How do I know you're an agent? It's not an easy question.
But from a place where I could never be. I couldn't look at myself from those eyes. And I can't capture the thing that is looking at me from those eyes. But nevertheless, there are leaps of the imagination which can put me in your point of view. And from that point of view, I can come to understand exactly what I am.
In other words, so when I talk about my soul as my story, I know my story from the inside. My wife knows my story from the outside, but from a particular perspective. My kids, all 5 of them, know my story from their own perspectives, and there's distortion and error and all of that and all of these stories. Just there's distortion and error in my story from the inside. My parents know me, my congregants know me, you YouTube viewers know me, and you would somehow need a, again, we're getting at God number 1 here. We somehow need a viewer, kind of number 1-ish to 2, would somehow need a transcendent viewer to know my story in and out, my story all the way back through into my grandparents from before I was conceived. And the roots of, let's say, my Dutch Calvinism or my American culture or the culture of the place in which I grew up, because that oozed into me. And lots of things apparently have souls. And if I were to be reconstituted and perfected and translated, that all would have to come into play in terms of doing that to me. So I love what Scruton does, and just recognizing just with two people you can begin to see these boundaries and the lay of the land here.
But in a completely different way from simply the ordinary empirical knowledge that I have of myself. And I think that sort of interpersonal understanding, I would say, we can adapt to all the other aspects of our world which are mysterious to us. Music, for instance. But that's a beginning.
And I want to return to music a bit later. Jordan.
Well, I think it's useful as an adjunct to that. So Roger mentioned that the transcendent is what we bump up against when we realize our ignorance.
And that's a key definition for Peterson. He comes back to it again and again. Is often we have a better we have a better grip on knowledge actually when we bump up to our ignorance, because then we're coming into something real, something which stops us.
So it's that which transcends our ignorance, and that in itself makes it an implacable fact, unless you believe that you have no ignorance, in which case there's no point in furthering a discussion with you. So the transcendent is the fact insofar as it's that which transcends our ignorance, but you can also think about it technically. So, and I think we know enough about how the brain works now, so that, not that we know much, so that useful things can be said about that. You tend to represent the world in the simplest manner that you possibly can, that works for what you're doing.
That's one of the favorite things, I think, my favorite things I've ever heard Jordan Peterson say, and that sticks in my brain deeply, because it's really a foundation, it's a footing for a whole bunch of really interesting things in terms of human beings. And it gets into this Barfieldian business, well, where he's about to go in a minute, this Barfieldian business about words have souls, that these words connect up into our souls, not necessarily as words, but the words are labels and give us manipulables outside of ourselves that we can begin to work on some of these things.
And so you don't actually see the world. You see sufficiently useful, low resolution representations of the world. And if they work, then that's fine. There's no need to adjust them, and they're relatively easy to remember and to manipulate. But now and then you have a misapprehension about someone, let's say, and you have a conversation with them, and the conversation goes sideways. And what that means is that the thing that you thought you were conversing with is not the thing that you're conversing with, and that manifests itself in error, right? So error is the place where the transcendent reveals itself. And what is actually revealing itself is the reality that's outside and underneath your perceptions. And so what you see in the world, in some sense, is a set of animated cartoons. And a lot of that is actually a consequence of you seeing nothing but your memory, because your brain is organized so that instead of going through all of the difficulty of having to look at the thing in itself, you look at what you assume to be there. And if you can get away with that, so much the better. But the thing in itself is always much richer than your apprehension of it, which is partly why you make mistakes, but also partly why you can continue to garner wisdom in the world. There's always more there than meets the eye. And God only knows how much more there's there than meets the eye.
Now, in these low resolution memories that we use to see the world, you can very much understand why consciousness changes over time, because these low resolution memories have all been shaped by the people in our lives, the language that we're using, the experience that we've had. This is the stuff we've all built in, and so it's the stuff we replay. And as a pastor, you have this experience. Often you're talking to someone, and it's sort of like the non-player character meme, where they're just boom, boom, boom. I talk to somebody. Hopefully, I gotta send them those videos. We'll post it, because he talked about Jacques Ellul's book Propaganda, and how, and we see this right now in our culture, our public discourse, everything is just simply repetitive, because people aren't actually thinking and engaging. They're just pushing propaganda points to each other. And so Barfield's idea of tracking the history of consciousness through words matches up here with this observation that Peterson makes about how we are, and then the transcendent, well, the transcendent, the big one, or that our touches of transcendence with each other happens in these spaces.
And you can show this even in the religious sense to some degree, because you could say that there's an element to the transcendent that instills people with a sense of religious significance. You can do that by immediately, scientifically, by feeding people chemicals, for example, that disrupt the inhibition of perception by memory. And then that puts them in a place where the transcendent tends to reveal itself, sometimes in overwhelming force. So this is not some fiction. That
I don't know if, the way he said that, and again, I don't know a lot about psychedelics, and I'm not going to try them, but you're taking some things offline with chemicals. Other things are still online, obviously. Otherwise, consciousness disappears. So I really don't know that we know what's going on with these things.
this exists. What's transcendent is more real than the reality that you perceive.
Well, let's pick up on that, because the ancients and the medievals had a clear sense that it wasn't the world that was changing, it was we ourselves as we make an ascent towards,
again, Barfield,
deeper truths, higher forms of the beautiful, as we ourselves become more self-conscious. So it's not the world that's changing, but us. I wonder if you could say how you understand the nature of that ascent, that movement, and what brings it about.
Well, I would be a bit wary of the metaphor of ascent. I think in Plato it's quite clear what he meant, that he wanted us to actually to transcend our earthly perceptions and our earthly way of seeing things and look on the world from a God's eye perspective. And this could be done if we enter the world of the pure forms and so on, leave empirical reality behind. I think actually, insofar as the experience of the transcendent, as I understand it, is available to us modern people, it's not that way that we get it. Perhaps Jordan might be right that there are these drug-induced experiences where things open up to us because old barriers are suddenly swept away. But in my own case, it is the concentration on the empirical reality which at a certain point flips from mere sensory understanding to a vision in that of its communicating something to me. And I think this is what literature and art and music do at their best. They redescribe reality so that it is actually communicating something to you. It's not just there as an inert object before you. And that sense of the transcendence is like discovering yourself in a mirror, seeing in the world as a whole that thing in you that you could never identify in words, the subject which is looking at it. And it's not a mystery, but it's something that you can't then explain. And it's the difference between a good writer and a bad writer, of course, is that a good writer will describe something in such a way that the thing described has the soul of the reader in it.
So that might be a distinction in part between the thing and the meaningful thing, right? And that's a very mysterious phenomenon. In fact, in some sense, the essence of phenomenon, because that means to shine forth. As we're surrounded by empirical facts, they're everywhere. There's more of them than we can possibly count, but some of them do emerge and manifest themselves as that conjunction between the factual and the meaningful, and then that's what's gripping. And if you're fortunate, to me, that's also partly what leads us onward, and maybe in something approximating the ascent that you described, is that the set of facts manifests itself as implicitly meaningful, and that means in some sense that there is a call to you that isn't from within you. I don't know how else to put it exactly, because you walk into a bookstore and a book will reveal itself to you, or or you have a conversation and part of the conversation will trigger something in you, or you're reading a scientific paper and much of it's dull, and then all of a sudden there's something that sparks outward that's like that's a portal into the transcendent. And that is a place where the fact and the meaning converge. And that's a phenomenon we don't understand very well. It has something to do with its convergence with the narrative that drives us.
Convergence with the narrative that drives us. It's the story. It's the story that is the movement of consciousness through time. Coleridge. Is there something else that's really below? Is metaphysics? Must we start with metaphysics? Can we know metaphysics? Is in fact what we're doing punching through something to another thing? And back to C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, where he takes apart an English school book. In their second chapter, Gaius and Titius quote the well-known story of Coleridge at the waterfall. You remember that there were two tourists present that one called it sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Gaius and Titius comment as followed: when the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was only making a remark about the waterfall, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but remark about his own feelings. He was a captive who couldn't see the waterfall, basically. What he was saying was that I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime. No, that's not it. Or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Here are a good many deep questions settled in a pretty summary fashion, but the authors are not yet finished. They add, this confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually we are only saying something about our own feelings. The question is whether we can penetrate through it. And of course, if you read C.S. Lewis's very brief little book, Lewis will take this on. Until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive but should merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. The reason why Coleridge agreed with the tourist who called the cataract sublime and disagreed with the one who called it pretty was, of course, that he believed inanimate nature to be such that certain responses should be more just or ordinate or appropriate to it than others, and he believed correctly that the tourists thought the same. The man who called the cataract sublime was not intending simply to describe his own emotions about it. He could have said, I was feeling awe. It's a fine sentence. But his claim that there would be nothing to agree, but for this claim, there would be nothing to agree or disagree about. To agree with, this is pretty, if those words simply describe the lady's feelings, would be absurd. If she had said, I feel sick, Coleridge would hardly have replied, no, I feel quite well. When Shelley, having compared the human sensibility to an Aeolian lyre, goes on to add that it differs from the lyre in having a power of internal adjustment whereby it can accommodate its chords to the notion of that which strikes them, he is assuming the same belief. Can you be righteous, asked Traherne, unless you be just in rendering to things their due esteem? We're back at Plato and Socrates. All things were made to be yours, and you were made to prize them according to their value. Metaphysics, epistemology, axiology. Modern skepticism writes to bracket out metaphysics in the hope that we can discern within the iron box of secularism what will be good enough. And I am skeptical of that claim. Esther writes, I think her best title, Sam Harris asks Jordan Peterson questions he can't answer. The box affords no reason to not be provocative by denying its limitations. You will lose status if you embrace faith based on revelation. All those I will lose status with will die and be forgotten. Got a better reason? That's the thing about the iron box of secularism. Your worldview is passed on through little remarks that give you clues about saying what things will give you status and saying which things will lose you status. And those are very powerful movements in us. But the box itself cannot offer us the kinds of things we really desire. We want to see real things. We want to see things that do not decay. We want to escape the suffering, the decay, the wheel that takes itself apart. We want to escape this suffering. We want to live forever. Ecclesiastes says he has placed eternity in our hearts. And I would add, we are haunted by it. I think we saw some of this play out this week at Notre Dame. Why the gasp as the fire burned through the great building, and why the pictures feel so poignant. And Rolling Stones asked, should we be making such a fuss about this building? Why were the people of Paris moved to tears? And listen to the commentary surrounding it. If we listen to ourselves, and Peterson is right, and Keller is right, they make the same points, and Vervaeke is right, the belief language and what we actually do and live, and our capacity to provoke transformational consciousness in us, we're really bad at this, and we're disconnected from ourselves. And when we saw the flames in Notre Dame, and when we heard people singing hymns in the streets, I thought, how many people are around there that know the hymns by heart? And why? And what does it mean? And where is it going? And right there, the very simple language of, do you believe in God? Well, fair enough. What do you mean by believe, and what do you mean by God? I've just spent 5 hours making a video about it. Why the hubbub about a building? Why the singing in the streets? Is the building sublime? Does it point to something eternal? And what do I mean by eternal? If we human beings destroyed each other through nuclear annihilation, some bad germ getting out of some bad laboratory, global ecological catastrophe, whatever, would sublimity remain? Does it transcend? Is it eternal? Is there eternity in our hearts or not? Language is about the only way we can really negotiate this, and so I've talked at you for 4.5 hours in these 2 videos. Do you believe in God? Depends what you mean by believe. Depends what you mean by God. Fair enough.